So we've got some time for some questions and comments. One right at the back there. Thank you very much. And just throw your hands in the air if you'd like to ask a question.
Thanks, Jeff Woolcock from Griffith University. I guess one of the more significant national household energy studies that was released in the last couple of years, Australian Conservation Foundation, that you'd be aware of, and one of the, particularly for an audience like this, one of the most significant interest that came out of that was to look at spatial differences.
Yeah.
You haven't got that in your study. Was that a deliberate thing, and if so, why?
Oh, we collected information, I believe, regarding dwelling size, and of course the relationship is entirely in the predicted direction with people that have larger dwellings, like using more energy. But because we're interested in their choices, that's not something that you can really choose once you're living in a house. Perhaps it's the case that you can make that choice to move into, to downsize, and that's going to be really significant and interesting if, as the previous speaker said, whole cohorts of people like the baby boomers shift from these wasteful large places into smaller, more energy and resource efficient ones. But for our householders, we looked at them within their current context. Yeah, it's a really interesting and important point.
And one at the back there, and then one over on the right. Thank you.
Hi, Rod Simpson from the University of Sydney. Coming from the Stalin estate of New South Wales, where I was involved with bringing in basics, which is obviously pure regulation. My question is, do you think there's a chance that you can actually rely on the sort of attitudes that you've put up to be a precursor to legislation and regulation, and that really to see whether this is a transitional phase? Because I'd have to say that in reflection on what's happened in basics, if you're familiar with it, it's 40% reduction compared to a benchmark of 2004 in energy and CO2.
Wow.
It's been monitored, and we didn't cook the books. It was 40.5% reduction in new houses for water, but the energy work hasn't been done, and I'm sure it'd show exactly what you've shown. So the question, I think, is in terms of perhaps ongoing research would be what people's attitudes are when they're confronted with, if you like, not their personal failure, but the failure of this change to meet the targets that we need to meet. So the question really is, how do you think whether you see this as a transitional phase to regulation, which brings about industry-wide change, and secondly, whether you think, that's enough anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. We could talk as a group for hours about that. There's no one answer, as I'm sure you know. Part of the issue involves, the political context and the institutional context. So people can choose to view it as a failure, or they can choose to view it as a success. And sometimes that decision is made in a political context. So, if people get excited about the idea that there's massive reduction, then the positive momentum for change is created. Whereas if they feel frustrated that it hasn't gone far enough, then that can become a source of inertia and rejection. And whether or not it's framed as a success or failure sometimes depends on bureaucratic and institutional and political infighting, and that you don't have control over in any respect. But the question in an earlier slide was raised of leadership. I mean, these are real social problems that people have to face. The problem in the environmental area, as it is in sustainable housing, is that they don't have to face them in the current 3-year or 4-year cycle. So there's no imperative which requires the political, bureaucratic, and institutional leaders to step up and take responsibility for solving a problem that's going to take years to solve and be well into the next electoral cycle. So, I mean, this is beyond the psychological into the social psych and political aspects. But this is, I think, the context for households' decision-making. I mean, do you feel frustrated about the state of the environment right now, or hopeful? The media messages are all pointing in one direction, and that's going to, we know from psychology that will feed into worse attitudes, lower intentions, and more behavioral rejection, and that's quite depressing, but interesting.
Okay, thank you. There's a question on the right. Yep.
Hi, I'm Tony Adams from the University of New South Wales. I actually live in a greyfields development. So one of the things I've noticed, because we had that paper and now we're having this one, there's actually no connection between those two. There is no way people living in a corporate structure can in fact implement most of those wonderful things you've talked about. For example, our hot water is a shared hot water system. So what incentive have I to save hot water system when I pay the same no matter how much I use? I could use a third of my entitlements, you might say, I'd still pay the full entitlement. And so I think there are a real disconnect there between what we say we want in terms of medium density housing and the growth in that, and what we're actually doing, because in fact most of our work is only looking at freestanding housing.
Yeah, no, it's an important point, and I think some other work I've seen has pointed to the high consumption of energy, in particular in sort of public shared spaces, which nobody takes ownership or responsibility of, lifts and corridors and these sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think there the shared identity, if possible, is really the source of change, the combination of feedback and a shared identity. So there's two things that go on in that, right? One is that you get no information about your personal use for the most part in a lot of these places. So you have no idea whether you're wasteful or not. Just providing people with that feedback sometimes motivates change, because most people don't want to be more wasteful than their neighbors. But the other issue is that if there's a sense that the community is going to take a step, that descriptive norm, right? We are all reducing and we're all going to have a payoff. If in order for people to have trust that that's going to work, they have to have a shared community identity. And that's where the freestanding houses are completely different than some of these larger corporate contexts. But just because there is a body corporate doesn't mean there's a community spirit. And that's something that people haven't really looked at. But our work with household culture shows even at a micro level, you can have these local norms that are powerful and contribute over and above your individual factors. So I completely believe that it would be possible to develop positive corporate identities around sustainability. And some individual businesses are trying to, and they report, for example, we are using less paper, we are using less water, we are using less waste, and employees get a kick out of that, you know? You participate in that community. But whether that could happen at a neighborhood level is an open question. I have data, although it's not published, to suggest that neighborhood identities are important in environmental decisions over and above national and household. And that's interesting. But the major thing was that it was actually interesting that outer suburbs are by far the least environmentally positive norms. Anyways.
Other questions? Thank you. Yes.
Just on that topic, my name's Alison, I'm from the Department of Communities and Housing and Homelessness. A couple of years ago, the Department of Housing actually introduced a system to introduce water-wise technology and attitudes within the public housing portfolio. And one of the things that actually came out of that was that from the data that was presented, public housing tenants actually use less water on the whole than private housing owners. And part of that is, to follow on from what you were saying, was that idea of there was actually shared commitment and there was information given to the public housing tenants around the fact that public housing tenants' use of water was within the particular 4 litres per person per day. One of the other things that was actually changed is that people did actually start to get information about their own private housing use. So that really changed the way that people actually viewed their water usage as well.
Yeah, and being based in Brisbane, I mean, we're so keen on water-wise. That was fabulous. Yeah, but sorry, the broader point. I was distracted by the fandom moment. Yeah, it's certainly the case. Like, both are important. One issue with individual level feedback, as some of you might know, is that sometimes if you give people information that they're wasting less than other people, instead of being proud and virtuous about that, they actually lower their standards and start wasting more. So that's something to address. But this idea that if a community targets change and then you feed back to them that the change is happening, that's descriptive norm change. That's the most powerful possible kind of social change, because it's information about what other people are doing and momentum, and that's a context where people will come on board. But it doesn't last indefinitely, right? So it has to turn into good technologies like the efficiency appliances, habitual behavior so that people aren't having to make an effort to have a short shower, they've just in the habit now, and institutional support and that kind of normative change. And if it doesn't reach those 3 levels, it kind of drops off and you fall back.
And can I just get you to tease out the, as I understand you're saying that households most prefer incentives, then regulation, then pricing. But in terms of establishing the sort of the norms that we want to guide the behaviours onto the future, we think that pricing probably is going to be most effective in setting those norms. Is that right? Or
Well, I'm not sure if it's pricing or regulation. I mean, one issue is that incentives are can be less effective than the other two because they mostly have that leverage on the people that already were committed. Right. So whether pricing is more effective than regulation, I'm not sure. I think it depends on the degree of elasticity in people's sustainable behavior. And interestingly, there's a subjective element to that. So, whether you feel you could possibly have a shower that's 4 minutes long. Coming from a Canadian context where we used to literally have 40 or 50-minute showers. I remember when I first heard the 4-minute shower idea, I laughed incredulously. So, is there capacity for people to reduce their energy usage, reduce their waste generation, and to reduce their water? There's a real strong subjective element to that, and that's where the household change is really important. So I think regulation is more better than incentives. I'm not sure if pricing is going to be more successful. It'll be more successful if people feel that they have the capacity to change. But for wealthy people, pricing doesn't impact them as much. That's an issue. And then for poor people, sometimes they just don't have the energy. It's like it takes energy to conserve energy. It takes mental energy. And sometimes even though they're potentially more motivated because of the financial pressure that they're under, they also have less capacity psychologically and sometimes socially to take those steps, especially with installing the big efficiency devices.
So it sounds like the happy middle ground might be the regulatory approach. I mean, certainly Rod's data suggests that it's effective.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's our sense as well, although our data doesn't speak to it in this sample.
Okay, thank you. As a question, sorry, did you want to carry on? Yeah, and then
And just in regard to the regulation, I think one of the things that we need to be careful of as well is the amount of regulations that are actually taking place at the time.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that we're actually seeing is that people are starting to talk about the nanny state being over-regulated. And so when we're trying to introduce some type of change, particularly positive change around environmental sustainability, for instance, we have to take into consideration the fact that there are lots of regulations in place and it can actually backfire.
That's right, especially that's the political context as well. If there's a bipartisan support, then there's no hassles kind of thing. But if it becomes if your area of policy is chosen as a battleground, then your capacity to move is much weaker.
Thank you. Question at the front.
Hi, I'm Claire Bennett from Group GSA. I'm an architect. And what I've found since the introduction of Section J in the BCA, which is the regulatory component you were talking about, is a substantial increase in the cost of building housing to the point of lack of affordability. So in a very naive way, we have continued with this, I wouldn't say over-regulatory environment, but a regulatory environment where the departments don't speak to each other. The energy efficiency guys don't speak to the, water guys, and it's all a big mixture of random contributions.
Yeah, death by 1,000 cuts. I mean, I think a lot of people have said that. And then it creates the backlash, doesn't it? I mean, this is the problem. So people prefer pricing because they think that, consumers won't blame them as much. But they also like regulation because they think they can hide, right? So I impose a regulatory change and they'll blame the developers but at some stage there's the possibility of a big backlash, and it's managing these tensions. There's no easy answer, but it does seem to be the case. There's lots of people talking from the development perspective that it's just too expensive now, and that the changes that have been implemented in the last 10 years are contributing to a crisis of affordability. And then there's this, possibility of political and institutional backlashes, and that would undermine all the progress that we've made. So managing these tensions, I don't see the easy answer there.
Well, certainly if this continues and we get more and more regulation in this area, the affordability is going to get worse. And I would say the most that will happen with that is more homelessness, more houses with greater number of people living in them, which will skew your research figures because there's more people living in the house. And I can't speak for the homelessness point of view, but I imagine that this, if you wouldn't take too much imagination to show this as the net result. So, is this good for communities to be done in such a regulatory manner?
There's a series of dilemmas there, aren't there? And there's a sort of upfront cost versus over time, sorts of dimensions of that as well in terms of sort of affordability.
And who's paying that price as well? It's the developers and the people buying the new houses, whereas those people that were lucky enough to buy in the old days continue on in their wasteful and extravagant way with their non-dual flush toilet.
I think, there's also, big price elements are obviously land and size of land. And we still, our new house construction, we've got that mantle of building the biggest houses in the world still, yet household size is falling. So I do wonder whether or not there are opportunities to think about some of those other sort of big chunks of price, certainly for new construction, rather than necessarily sort of wanting to trade off on the environmental sustainability sort of side of things. But there's obviously a set of tensions there that have got to be managed in all of this.
Yes.
Look, we must move. We must move on. I'll ask you to sort of catch up with Winnifred, but please join me in thanking Winnifred. We're going to move on to look at a different sort of policy area, but also one that does connect with our previous conversation around some of these environmental sustainability issues, looking at notions of health and well-being and the health impacts of housing.